Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this presentation. This is actually the second attempt at, or Mark II if you like, for looking at generalship and the competence of generalship in World War I and the application and development of military theory. Now, I did a video a couple of days ago on this, and I got a number of complaints. One was that it should be scripted, and another was that the volume was too low. So I haven't done a script, but I've got a few headings here that I'm running off. And so let's jump straight into it. Now, General Haig, Field Marshal Haig, as he later became during World War I, the British general and the chief war officer, or chief battle officer on the front lines there on the Western Front. He was later, years later after the war, condemned for loss of life on the battlefield. The casualties were very high for very little achieved, and therefore he was treated, you're a butcher. In fact, the term butcher was used for Haig. Was this fair? Was he in fact a useless, incompetent moron? Was his incompetence a cause of the many deaths that occurred on the battlefront? So let's have a look at that. Now, like many things, the situation is relative, not absolute. Was he absolutely a moron or absolutely 100% a military genius? Well, it's somewhere in between. But on top of that, it's relative because he's up against other combatants. A brilliant general like Napoleon Bonaparte could make even good quality generals look bad because Napoleon was an unusual military genius. The same goes for, say, Julius Caesar. He was a particularly competent general, and therefore he made other generals who in any other circumstances would look pretty good. He made them look inadequate only because Caesar was himself a military genius, or certainly of a caliber greater than those that he was up against. So we need to consider that. Now, the German army coming up to World War I, so as it's particularly from, say, the 1860s up to and including World War II, really, the German army was the best led, best trained, best organised, best logistics, superb quality of reconnaissance and things like that. And in almost every aspect, military theory, development of military doctrine, planning, at almost every level, the German army was superior to any other military force around. So when it came to a battle or a war, then they could make the other guys look ordinary or even incompetent, and we need to consider that very much in as we study Haig, or indeed other generals. We need to consider that as being an important part. Now, the British military establishment, they hadn't faced a First World or top line army since really the Napoleonic Wars. And we need to put the Battle of Waterloo in some perspective. Napoleon was on target on track to win that battle. He was going to defeat the Duke of Wellington. It would have been a close run thing. Casualties would have been heavy, and Napoleon's army wouldn't have been in very good shape to fight another battle anytime soon. Nonetheless, it's pretty clear that Napoleon would have won that battle. But the corps, the units, military units Napoleon sent to keep the Prussians away from the battlefield, they dragged their feet a little bit. The Prussian army with Field Marshal Blucher were able to sort of do a curving march and then actually make it to the battlefield in the afternoon of that Battle of Waterloo. And that tipped the balance, and as a result, the Duke of Wellington's prevailed in that battle. But it was only just, and had the Prussians arrived even a few hours later, then I think the British, with their allies like the Dutch and the Walloons and so on, would have been defeated. So the British hadn't had a major war. You can look at the Boer War in South Africa against the South African hit and run guerrillas. You can look at those sorts of things. The battles around the empire against the brown and black sort of armies that sometimes went badly. The siege of Khartoum, for example, the death of General Gordon, the battles in the Indian Mutiny, again the Boer War and so on. But the British had never had a massed army and had never faced a major first-rate army at all for more than 100 years. So their military doctrine and thinking, the sort of people they were promoting into the senior ranks, represented a doctrine that had really gone into drift or really didn't exist at all. So their concept of a European war, the British concept, was that the French army, which was considered, the British actually considered the French army the first-rate army in the world, which I thought was interesting because the French hadn't had a major battle since, again, really the Napoleonic Wars, and then the only major battle they'd had, they were soundly defeated. But the British viewed the Franco-Prussian War, where the Prussians had won relatively quickly in the overall scheme of things. They saw that as just a one-off case of silly bungling by Napoleon III, and something that shouldn't be a reflection on the French military establishment. So they sort of looked past that and had really rose-coloured glasses about the quality of the French army. Not that the French army was bad, by the way, or useless. Far from it. It was a first-rate army. It's just that, again, the Germans were better. So the British really had no military doctrine to speak of. And if you look at the sort of officer class they had, they were unable to come to grips with what was modern warfare, which was heavy field artillery, railways, and machine guns, things like that, and of course later on coming into aircraft. Now, when it came to the newer technologies of aircraft and tanks, the British actually embraced those reasonably quickly in the overall scheme of things. So the British weren't averse to looking at new technology. They just didn't have that military doctrine that a large first-rate army would have, and particularly the quality of the German. Now, the German General Staff, or Prussian General Staff as it was before Germany federated in the 1870s, these guys had a rigorous education for officers. And you can see the groundwork to this, the German or Prussian, even going back to the time of the Napoleonic Wars, this desire and this motivation to develop a military theory that was flexible enough to be applied into different circumstances and different situations. Clausewitz was a good example of that in the earlier days. Something that's even studied today, Clausewitz on War, which is a long and fairly rambling and in some places even an intractable essay, but nonetheless it's a fairly good window into this concept of military doctrine, and so anyone looking at that, it'd certainly be worth reading. So the Germans had this: let's get some bright people. Not that they weren't aristocrats; most of them were. Let's get some bright people. Let's be rigorous in our education, and let's put these guys through a military training school. And clearly, it was the best in the world, and also covered areas, things like reconnaissance and so on. You think, well, reconnaissance, who gives a shit? But reconnaissance, and even you saw this in World War II, the Wehrmacht reconnaissance units would find the areas of the front line that were least defended and that were most passable and were where decisive breakthroughs could take place time and time again. And whether it be in the World War I and particularly in World War II, you see this reconnaissance. That was something that was part of the overall training, and also the devolving of decision-making to lower down officers. If they were on the spot and they reasonably believed that this would be the breakthrough point, they could start making those arrangements. They had, if you like, a permission. It was understood, the quality of their training and their ability was understood, that they could be allowed to make those decisions, at least in the preliminary stage. Sure, final sign-offs would be the generals and the field marshals, but that meant that you could save many hours, if not days, in organisation and preparation, whereas another army that was top-heavy, where only the most senior guys could make the smallest decisions, they were much slower to respond and far more cumbersome. So the Germans had a lot of inbuilt flexibility there because of the high quality and the shared faith in each other that the other armed forces of other nations, Britain as an example, didn't have. So the Germans had the most advanced military doctrine and the best training, but they also had the most advanced metallurgy in the world. You could say that the Americans were competing on that field, but down to micron level, the metallurgy and the quality of the manufacture of heavy field artillery and other equipment meant the Germans had interchangeability of parts, and they were much quicker to repair, and they could get damaged artillery pieces and so on back into production or back into the line and firing away much quicker than could the others, where even though the specification was the same for a piece of field artillery, there's factory to factory there was a difference of microns in the manufacturing standards, so parts were not interchangeable, or certainly not to the same degree. So unless you got another artillery piece from the same factory, then you couldn't interchange the parts with that same model of artillery that was made in a different factory, due to, again, the quality of the metallurgy and the level of precision in the micron level of precision in the manufacture. So there were a whole number of levels where the Germans were simply better. This meant that they made the other guys look more amateurish than they really would have been in other circumstances, and that I can't overemphasize that enough. That needs to be appreciated. Just because you have one really smart guy, in the say, I don't know, college or high school or something, just because you're really one smart guy in the class, it doesn't mean everyone else is stupid. It just means that guy's unusually smart, and this was the case with the German army. It was just unusually good relative to the other participants. Now, other starry-eyed notions that the French and the British had was that the Russian army would be, this is in World War One, the Russian army would be so huge and numerous that simply through, the swarming type concept, simply through the vast numbers, they would overrun Germany, and it was, the Russian steamroller was one of the terms that was used. And harking back again to the Napoleonic Wars, when mass Russian armies could sweep through Europe and overwhelm the French, that happened actually very rarely in the Napoleonic Wars. Nonetheless, this idea of mass substituting for quality was something that the British and the French entertained through starry-eyed notions. None of it was real. It was all pie in the sky. And the Germans showed this in World War One with battles such as Tannenberg, where considerably outnumbered Germans, just better quality, better equipped, and also better logistical machine. They were able to move around to the key points far more quickly than the Russians could. Better support and so on. They were able to inflict crushing defeats on the Russians, even though the Russians were overall far more numerous. So this also needs to be taken into account. The British and the French were presuming that they would have far more capable allies than they really would have. The British considered the First World Wars that the British would as the phrase, I think I'm almost quoting here, we will not allow the German Navy and forces to operate in the North Sea or the English Channel, and then they will provide equipment and small military support to the French. So the British envisioned that they would supply armed forces of somewhere between 150 and 300,000 men. Well equipped, they would supply the French military with equipment, so the British manufacturing base would come into action, and then they would blockade Germany using the British Navy, and would also prevent the Germans from engaging in naval operations along the English Channel, North Sea, and anywhere else. So that was to be the British contribution. It quickly became clear that the British would have to make a much larger contribution, so they were forced into calling up larger armies and, of course, eventually conscription. This was something the British hadn't anticipated, and the ratio of machine guns to artillery field pieces to personnel, soldiers, boots on the ground, was simply not adequate. It was probably 1916 before the British really caught up. Now, the British attempt to compensate for their lack of equipment, and again, they're playing catch up here, and they've got a big manufacturing sort of industry to do that. Some of the French manufacturing industry had been overrun around the frontier or near to it and in northern France, so the British had to make up for that as well. When you look at the resources of the French and the British combined, they should have defeated the Germans sort of fairly quickly, certainly within a couple of years, if not less. And if you look at the populations available to the British and the French, and the military and the industrial resources and the financial resources, they should have won. So why didn't they? Well, the reason for that, I would say, is not per se incompetent generalship on the British and French part. It's just that for every dollar spent, for every bullet manufactured, the Germans were able to inflict far more casualties than they received. So given their resources, they were able to be far more effective with much less resources than the British and the French were. By contrast, the British and the French wasted a lot of their resources through again, not necessarily incompetence, although you could argue that from time to time, but more they didn't understand or couldn't come to grips with the level of professionalism and mass industrialisation and mass mobilisation of the resources of the nation to prosecute the war. The Germans understood that far more effectively, and again they were better led. If you look at the attacks when the German army attacked in World War I, this is on the Western Front I'm talking about now, they were far more successful in inflicting casualties, and they received fewer casualties and inflicted more casualties than the French or the British did in the same situation. So when the British attacked on the Western Front, they gained far fewer results, achieved much less for a much higher rate of casualties. And similarly, higher rate of casualties, not just in personnel, but in the amount of materiel that they had to consume to achieve what was close to almost nothing, to gather a few yards on the front line. So we're looking at a situation where the British and the French are having to receive 3 casualties for every 2 they inflict. And it's costing them $5, for example, I'm simplifying this here, it's costing them $5 to prosecute that particular offensive on the front, whereas the Germans are only spending $2 to repel them. When the reverse is the case, then again, even in attack, the Germans are still inflicting 3 casualties for every 2 received. So they're still, and consuming much less material to achieve that. So we're talking about in total war here, not simply the military establishment, but also the industrial and manufacturing establishment that was managed far more effectively. So coming back to is or was Haig and the British generals useless and incompetent? No, I don't think so. I think they were behind the times. I don't think the military doctrine had caught up with the era. I don't think they'd fully appreciated the artillery and the use of artillery, its mass employment, mass use of machine guns and so on. I don't think they'd appreciate that as fully as the Germans had. But again, this demonstrates how far ahead in military theory the Germans were, rather than how much the British had fallen behind. I should point out that there was no major war had occurred where massed artillery and machine guns had been used up to that point. So it was all new greenfields territory in terms of understanding the extent that such technology would be employed and how widespread it would be employed. So this was, again, the German military thinking was ahead of its time, and the British and French thinking, Russian thinking was behind the time. But again, I can't overstress. There had been no major war where massed artillery machine guns had been employed. So it was something that was new to everybody. But the Germans were ahead of the pack in understanding its application and its relevance and its employment, and were able to employ it not necessarily decisively, but certainly were able to employ it to great effect. When World War One was kicking off, I guess there's a few other things to consider here. Coming back to whether Haig was inadequate or not, was if you look at the various sectors of the battlefront, whether it be the French or the British Empire and Commonwealth sectors of the front. So, say the Australian troops on the front and the Canadian troops, so General Currie and General Monash, Monash being the Australian general. Now, if you look at those fronts there, or those sections, and if you look at the casualties the Canadians and the Australians received for the casualties they inflicted and the material they consumed in those offensives or in defence for that matter, and it was decently less than the British sector. So why was that different? Did the Australians or the Canadians have more equipment or better equipment or anything like that? No, but they did have. No, they didn't. But they did have different generalship, and they had a style of generalship in Monash and Currie, where they prepared to look at how can we achieve more, how can we sustain fewer casualties but have greater achievement, capture more territory or inflict more casualties or whatever, but to make it a winning proposition rather than a stalemate or a losing proposition. And if you look at the material, the men employed, material employed and so on, the casualties in the British sector were greater than any of the others. And that does tell us something, I think. And so, but the Australian and Canadians began to substantially reduce casualties, but without reducing the amount of activity that they were engaged in. So this demonstrates to me the different generalship and different consideration down to the micro level of tactics. And the Germans were prepared to consider that down to the micro level, by the way. What can we do to produce a better result? They were prepared to go back to the drawing board. The British generals much less so. And similarly, the British generals looked for, which is very much in the wars that the British Empire has always fought, they were looking for that strategic masterstroke, that push button that was going to turn it all around. And they took that attitude to, I think, World War One, looking for strategic masterstrokes and for that one big thing that was going to make the difference, rather than going back to the drawing board and concentrating on, let's go through every detail, let's go through everything, and let's find out how we can improve it. The Germans were quite prepared to look at 100 small sort of micro level adjustments and innovations, if you will, in battle tactics. They were quite prepared to look at that because in the aggregate it made a big difference. But the British bypassed that. Nah, we don't care about that. Let's look at again the big ticket, the big masterstroke thing, and that I think blinded them to what they could do, because the British and the Canadians didn't have a seat at the absolute pinnacle table, other than an honorary seat. They were prepared to look at the micro level and how can we do things differently, and I think that was the difference. So similarly, in the industrial sense, politicians like Lloyd George and others, even Asquith and so on, they would look at Churchill too. They would look at the war. Okay, well let's just make more machine guns and more cannons, and let's do this and let's do that. They weren't looking at I think the whole picture and how the various parts of the picture made up the whole. Instead, they would go into again strategic masterstroke stuff. If we double the amount of field artillery pieces, we'll be able to blast the Hun into the Stone Age and we'll win the battle, rather than looking at how defence in depth was working and the structural nature of the defence that the Germans were very good at, by the way. So when you look at all of that, I would not go down the path that Haig was an idiot or useless or incompetent. I would argue that the British and the French were behind the times. They were up against the best army in the world that was constantly adapting and evolving, and was evolving and adapting at a faster rate than the British and the French were. And as a result, it made the British and French look ordinary. And whereas in fact they were decent enough. That they weren't perfect, but they were decent enough. They were just up against a much better quality enemy, and I think that's really the material point. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.